The girl never imagined that the man who offered 1 million gold coins to buy her was simply driven by lust. That's enough to buy a small country, you know. Even more unexpectedly, despite the male lead's attentive care towards her, the castle was filled with numerous torture devices. She expected to be cruelly tortured, but the male lead carefully arranged her lodgings, and considerately led her to her room. This might become the sweetest love story. As a demon lord, I married a slave elf as my wife. How should I express my love? A story about expressing love. It begins at this moment. In this world, most magicians are evil beings. They pursue the pinnacle of magic. They spared no extreme measures in conducting various experiments. This magician before us, for his own research, intended to flay the skin from this redhead girl's face. In his view, this was the best magical medium. However, the male protagonist was different. He not only killed that man, but also returned the unconscious girl to town. The male protagonist is similarly immersed in the world of magic, but he hardly ever leaves his own territory. You could say he's a shut-in who's been cooped up for decades, but unlike those evil magicians, he wasn't interested at all in evil magic requiring human sacrifices, like flaying. Not at all. That is, until today. The protagonist's magician friend, Purple Hair, came to visit, bringing news of a demon lord's death. And the person who held that title can obtain powerful magic. You can also command lower-level magicians as your servants. It's arguably the peak of magic. There are 13 demon lords in this world, and the one who recently passed away was the oldest, 1,000 years old. With his passing, his inheritance was taken to auction. Among them, there must be something that interests two people. Then the male protagonist and the purple-haired one arrived at the auction house. They found many big shots already waiting there. They were all strong candidates for the Demon King, and the male protagonist, as the youngest genius magician, he is also the most powerful candidate for Demon King. The final item at the auction is a spirit. This is a legendary spirit race captured in the Northern Holy Land, and it's an extremely rare self-haired spirit. Spirits are unlike humans. They are more like gods or divine beings. She could be used not only as a sacrifice for magic experiments, but also as a slave to be toyed with at will. To be loved as he pleased. 1 million. The male lead, without hesitation, poured out all his wealth, just to bid for that sprite. No one in the audience dared to bid against him, because even the most precious elf wasn't worth that exorbitant price. But for the male lead, she was a priceless treasure beyond measure. From the moment he saw her, his heart filled with an inexpressible thrill. The sprite was indifferent to its new owner, for she firmly believed that no matter who the owner was, her fate would ultimately be death. However, after the male lead successfully bought the elf, he found he had absolutely no idea how to start a conversation. After all, he was a seasoned otaku. He had no clue how to talk to women, completely clueless. He didn't know where to begin. When the girl misunderstood his intentions, the male lead hurriedly explained, stating that he had no intention of harming her. Rather, if she was to die, he would be very troubled. However, to the girl, these words only meant the master wanted her to experience a more agonizing death. Coupled with the disturbing instruments of torture in the room, her fear deepened. She didn't know that these instruments were actually left behind by the previous city lord, and the male lead was simply too lazy to dispose of them. It just stayed there. The misunderstanding deepened. The clumsy male lead tried to change the subject, but he was too nervous to even ask the girl's name, something so simple. Finally, the girl broke the silence. She said her name is Syphilia. If you dislike the nickname, master can call me Sherfei, because I am a child of a curse. I don't have a surname. She also comforted the male lead, saying he doesn't need to worry about her physical condition. Since being captured, she was not violated by anyone. Even as a test subject, she remained untouched. The male lead regretted it as soon as he finished speaking. He couldn't directly express his true feelings. For example, I actually fell in love with you at first sight, so I spared no expense and bought you. These words, to a pure and lovely elf girl, would undoubtedly make him seem like a pervert. Trying to calm his inner turmoil, the male lead decided to first arrange a room for Syphilia. Syphilia mistakenly thought the male lead was letting her choose a place to die. But then Syphilia heard the male lead explain that he wouldn't harm her. Syphilia couldn't understand why he was so gentle to her, because in her understanding, regardless of his purpose, she would ultimately die anyway. Only then did the male lead realize that Syphilia had been captured and sold as a slave. And a slave's fate is nothing more than becoming a sacrifice or a lab rat. Although he didn't understand what Syphilia meant by cursed child, it didn't sound like anything good. Before being enslaved, Syphilia may not even have had a home, and the male lead himself had experienced a similar situation. He doesn't know his surname. He doesn't know who his parents are either. Since he can remember, he has lived in a garbage dump. Even the name Sagan is just a name others casually gave him. The male lead then planned to take Syphilia to choose a room to rest. Just as Syphilia tripped, the male lead quickly reached out and pulled her into his arms. He silently enjoyed this brief moment of intimacy. Although outwardly he tried to remain calm, his heart was in turmoil. The male lead immediately brought Syphilia to a beautifully decorated room. However, the moment he opened the door, to alleviate Nephi's fear, he instinctively cast an explosive spell. With the spell's release, the guillotine in the room was instantly blown to smithereens. However, to the male lead's surprise, Syphilia, after witnessing his powerful magic, felt even more fear. She had never seen such shocking magic. Despite this, Syphilia ultimately decided to rest in this room. This girl could never have imagined that the candidate for the Demon King who had spent all his fortune to buy her was so innocent. The morning after bringing Syphilia home, the male lead carefully prepared dried meat and milk for her breakfast. Syphilia noticed that the male lead was also enjoying the same food as her. Syphilia was clearly a little puzzled. Seeing how simple the male lead's daily life was, Syphilia decided to cook herself. She wanted to improve the male lead's quality of life. However, the ingredients at home were scarce. The male lead planned to take Syphilia to town by carriage to buy necessities. However, because he had bought Syphilia yesterday, he had already spent all his savings. He couldn't afford the carriage. With no other choice, they could only walk. Unexpectedly, they had only just set off when they witnessed a carriage being robbed by bandits. The male protagonist initially didn't intend to intervene, because he thought the bandits were just harmless commoners. But seeing Syphilia's fear, he began to speculate. Syphilia might have had a similar experience. She might have been abducted like this before. This makes the male protagonist unable to stand idly by. He decides to take action. These people are nothing but a bunch of rabble. The bandit gang sees the magician appear. Although they felt some fear, they believed the male lead couldn't continuously cast magic. Therefore, they charged without hesitation. However, what they didn't anticipate was that the male lead's power was equally formidable. Seeing their leader so easily defeated, the gang's underlings hurriedly called for their hidden boss. Soon, a magician appeared. Though he was puzzled that the protagonist, a magician himself, would help others. Because he had a contract with the bandits, he cast a spell on the protagonist without a second thought. However, the protagonist saw through the magic formation with a single glance. Seeing the magician defeated, the robbers fled the scene as quickly as possible. Syphilia stood to the side, watching the protagonist with a surprised expression. Meanwhile, the merchant from the carriage approached, offering the protagonist a bag of silver coins in gratitude. He then invited him to be his bodyguard and travel to the town together. Faced with such a win-win proposal, the male lead naturally had no reason to refuse. On the way to town, Syphilia curiously asked the male lead why he was willing to help those people. The male lead originally wanted to say that he did it to protect her. Or perhaps he wanted to help the weak. But when it came time to speak, his words took a different turn. Soon, the two arrived in town. The man thought, besides buying ingredients, he can also get some necessities for Syphilia. Considering Syphilia's status as a slave, she might not proactively ask for anything, so he decided on my own to take her to a clothing store. The shopkeeper saw that the visitor was a magician. She froze for a moment. Though fear welled up inside her, her professionalism prevented her from fleeing. Seeing this, the male lead told the shopkeeper he wanted to pick out a suitable outfit for Syphilia. Upon seeing Syphilia, the shopkeeper immediately admiring her beauty, but fell silent again when the light fell on the slave collar around her neck. Then the shopkeeper led Syphilia to try on clothes. The male lead also realized that the collar around Syphilia's neck was too conspicuous. He was just figuring out how to take it off. Just then, Syphilia appeared before them in an extremely alluring outfit. Hearing these words, the shopkeeper was confused, because logically, such an outfit perfectly matched the male lead's preferences. It's both bold and subtle. Irresistible. If the male lead says he doesn't like it, he's clearly lying. Feeling the male lead's ardent gaze, Syphilia couldn't help but feel a little shy. Quickly, Syphilia changed into a proper maid's uniform. Each piece was meticulously crafted from high-quality materials. Even the shoes contained healing magic, effectively alleviating fatigue from prolonged standing. He was very pleased with this outfit. The male lead was very satisfied, and asked Syphilia for her opinion. Syphilia replied, as long as the master likes it, she doesn't mind what she wears. Although the shopkeeper felt a little regretful, but after their interaction just now, she could tell Syphilia had found a master who cherished her. She was genuinely happy for Syphilia. Then the male lead brought Syphilia to a blacksmith's shop, hoping the shopkeeper could help Syphilia remove the collar around her neck. Syphilia was surprised at this request, just as she was about to speak to the male lead that she doesn't need to remove the collar. But he interrupted. The male lead said if she continue wearing the collar, she will always be the property of the Demon King Magesha, so she didn't need this thing. Syphilia's ears instantly turned red, but the shopkeeper looked troubled. Syphilia's collar is actually a magical artifact. He doesn't have the skill to remove it. Plus, there's a trap set on the collar. If it's not removed according to the proper procedure, Syphilia's head might separate from her body. So the best way is to unlock it with the key. The male lead carefully recalled. No one at the auction had the key either. This meant the key was probably somewhere in Magesha's castle. Upon learning this, the male lead offered some silver coins to thank the shopkeeper. but the shopkeeper firmly refused. The male lead mistakenly thought the shopkeeper was being disrespectful. Actually, 2.5 months ago, the shopkeeper had received help from the male lead. Their carriage had been attacked at that time, and it was the male lead who saved him and his daughter. They were very scared at the time. They ran away without thanking him. He felt guilty about it ever since. After leaving the shop, he felt something was wrong. He noticed that people around him were unusually friendly today. He wondered if it was Sophilia's influence, but he didn't know that he used to have a cold and ruthless aura. But now, his eyes are full of gentleness and affection. After buying the necessary ingredients, it was getting dark. Considering it would be too late to return to the castle, the male lead brought Sophilia to a restaurant for a meal. However, not long after they sat down, Sophilia couldn't help but voice her question. She asked the male lead why he wants to remove her collar. Wasn't he worried she would run away? The male lead frankly admitted that it wasn't true that he wasn't worried. After all, there's no strong bond between them. It's understandable if she chooses to run away. But even if Sophilia flees, he will still choose to remove this collar. It's just not possible in the short term. It also saves Sophilia from pointless expectations. Hearing these words, Sophilia couldn't help but laugh. Immediately afterwards, Sophilia stared intently at the steak on the table. The male lead thought she wouldn't know how to use a knife and fork. Actually, Sophilia felt somewhat touched, because she was a cursed child. Since childhood, she had been ostracized. This is the first time I've ever sat down and eaten a proper meal like this. This scene also made the male lead understand why he cared so much about Sophilia. Because Sophilia was like his former self, powerless and without a home. The emptiness in her eyes was also due to her despair towards the world. Then the male lead told Sophilia to eat well, choose what she likes to eat. Now there's no one she needs to worry about in front of her. Sophilia originally thought it would be sweeter, but the moment the juice burst in her mouth, she felt immense happiness. Seeing this, the male lead wanted to show her the correct way to eat it, but unexpectedly, he messed up. Actually, Sophilia thought the male lead wouldn't give her any orders, so she hoped to help her master as much as possible within her abilities. The male lead also agreed after hearing this. He recalled the scene of Sophilia feeding him just now. He thought to himself that in return, it seemed only reasonable that he should feed Sophilia. Meanwhile, inside the church, the red-haired girl recalled what had happened earlier. She realized it wasn't a dream, but it really happened. She never imagined a magician would save her. She remembered, after defeating the evil magician who targeted young girls, she was attacked by a magician known as the Face Peeler on her way back. At the critical moment, the male lead appeared and saved her life. Although the male lead's eyes looked fierce, but she always felt a hint of loneliness hidden deep within those eyes. Just then, the bishop approached. He told her that the previous serial kidnapping case hadn't truly ended. According to the investigation of the magician's base, they discovered another true culprit. The magician, Sagan. That is, the male lead. He's the mastermind behind the series of kidnappings. The girl couldn't believe it. She questioned whether the intelligence was wrong, but the bishop insisted that the magician himself is the embodiment of evil. Even if they are unrelated to the incident, their wickedness must be eradicated. This will never change. Faced with the unconvincing bishop, the girl made a request. She wished the bishop would entrust her with the task of hunting down the magician, Sagan. The man unexpectedly discovered that his elf wife's ears would twitch involuntarily whenever she was happy. This adorable sight was truly endearing. However, the man never imagined that his newlywed elf wife will see his own injury. He actually went straight into a rampage state. When the male lead woke up in the morning, the first thing he saw was Sophilia standing before him, quietly waiting for him to wake up. Her thoughtfulness is further shown in the breakfast prepared for him. The once chaotic cafeteria, under Sophilia's skillful hands, had become orderly. Thinking of being able to savor the breakfast cooked by his beloved girl, the male lead felt a surge of happiness. His hand holding the tray trembled slightly. Just then, the male lead noticed a detail. Whenever Sophilia felt happy, her pointed ears would involuntarily tremble slightly. Upon learning that Sophilia hadn't had breakfast yet, he immediately invited her to have breakfast together. However, only one place was set at the table. So the male lead subconsciously patted his own leg, signaling that Sophilia could sit on his lap. When he realized what he had said, his cheeks instantly flushed. Despite his inner shyness, on the surface, he still pretended to be tough. Several days later, a few days passed like this. The male lead was engrossed in studying magic in the library. Sophilia came in and started cleaning. She curiously asked him what exactly he was researching. She also couldn't understand the magic circle at all. The male protagonist curiously asks if elf and human magic are different. Sophilia, however, says she doesn't know because she doesn't use magic. The male protagonist finds this interesting, because Sophilia clearly possesses purer magical power than ordinary people. So he draws a sigil representing the concept of power on the floor. These crests are said to be writings left behind by gods. Others believe they are proof of a pact with demons. He explained that when the magic circle is completely drawn and infused with magical power, the power within the writings can be activated. That's the principle of magic. If you want to increase the magic's power, you can add emblems with enhancing effects to the magic circle. For example, emblems that expand the release range and emblems that set the activation time. Then, after infusing magic power, the power will increase by 2.5 times. The structure of the magic circle is also called a circuit. If one could interfere with and control the opponent's magical circuits, then no magic could harm that person, because any magical attack launched against him would simply be controlled and utilized by that mage. Theoretically, such a person would be the strongest mage. However, the male protagonist added that theory is just theory, after all. If all this could be easily achieved, then everyone wouldn't be studying magic tricks so seriously. After hearing the protagonist's explanation, Sophilia also seemed to understand the principle of the magic trick. As long as one understands the structure of the magic circle, then anyone can use magic. Hearing this, the male lead thought to himself, Sophilia truly has a talent for magic. She's right. A magician's knowledge and power are directly related. Therefore, some magicians steal the research results of others. And to prevent others from taking this knowledge, they usually set a lot of traps. After all, the male lead only knows magic. When he encounters his area of expertise, he naturally talks endlessly. Sophilia curiously asked him, possessing such powerful strength, does he have any expectations in his heart? Sophilia regretted her words as soon as they left her mouth. She realized that as a slave, such a question seemed somewhat overstepping. However, the male lead didn't mind. He frankly admitted that he hadn't thought deeply about the issue. But if he had to say something, perhaps it was for survival. He recalled his childhood. Without money or a place to live, he had to rely on theft to survive. Luckily, even when caught, his life wasn't in danger. Until one day, he was captured by a magician, because children could be used as high-quality magical sacrifices. Luckily, before he was killed, he managed to kill the magician. From then on, he understood. Only by obtaining power can one survive. Therefore, he yearned to become stronger. If one were to speak of desires, then naturally, it would be immortality. Sophilia recalled her own experiences, strikingly similar to the protagonist's childhood, but she didn't become as powerful as the male lead. Seeing Sophilia's dejection, the male lead was about to offer to teach her magic, but suddenly sensed a group of people intruding on his territory. This instantly enraged him. He told Sophilia to prepare their dinner. He went out to greet these uninvited guests. And these invaders were church knights led by a red-haired woman. Their purpose was to vanquish the male protagonist. The red-haired woman cut through the castle's barrier with a single sword, and confronted the male protagonist at the gate. The young man recognized the red-haired woman as the girl he had once saved. Although the knights couldn't harm him, they were quickly defeated. But he didn't kill them, instead making excuses for them to retreat. Actually, he was more worried about leaving bodies around the castle. It would scare Sophilia. But Redhead is also very clever. She saw through that the male lead wouldn't harm the hostage. So she raised her holy sword and attacked. Just a graze from the sword's edge and the male lead's defensive magic crumbled. Luckily, the wielder of the holy sword wasn't strong enough. The male lead could easily dodge all attacks. Suddenly, the red-haired fiercely attacked the male lead, forcing him against a tree, leaving him unable to move. Faced with a desperate situation, the male lead, having no choice, was about to deliver a killing blow, but he heard the redhead whispering in his ear. The redhead suggested the male lead pretend to be defeated by her, because if the male lead didn't die, the church would not give up. If she failed, the church will send a stronger paladin. If the male lead pretends to be killed, and gives up magic, he can live as an ordinary person. The redhead reveals that she was once saved by the male lead. Therefore, she specifically accepted this mission to act in this play. The male lead understands that the redhead is risking her life to help him, because if the Holy Knights were to discover that he was sheltering a magician, he would not only be stripped of his title, but also subjected to cruel interrogation and execution, even though the other person is acting out of gratitude. But if the male lead runs away, Sophilia will face danger again. At this tense moment, Sophilia actually heard the sounds of battle and ran out of the castle. The knights mistook Sophilia for the protagonist's accomplice and charged towards her without hesitation. At the critical moment, the male lead stepped forward and took the fatal blow for Sophilia. The male lead's injury enraged Sophilia. Her anger erupted instantly. Ultimately, the knights retreated before Sophilia's power. The redhead apologized to the male lead, because innocent people were caught in this conflict. Back at the castle, the male protagonist curiously asked Sophilia what kind of power she had used. Sophilia explained that she used magic, a mysterious power somewhere between sorcery and witchcraft. She recalled her childhood. Just because she can use magic, she was ostracized by her entire tribe. Some even wished for her death. But when bandits attacked the elf village, her tribe expected her to save the village. Yet she did nothing. She just watched helplessly as the villagers were slaughtered. She herself was also captured. Although her heart was filled with guilt, she also felt an almost morbid sense of satisfaction. This twisted sense of revenge made her feel like she might be unwell. However, the male lead told Syphilia that it wasn't her fault. He said frankly, if it were him, he probably would have slaughtered the whole group long ago. After Syphilia confided her troubles to the male lead, she finally untied the knot she'd had for so long. As night fell, Syphilia shyly looked at the male lead, clutching a pillow. At this crucial moment, the male lead's thoughts were like an overloaded CPU, almost boiling over. Colorful images flooded his mind. Just these thoughts almost overwhelmed him. However, he was overthinking it. The reason is simple. It's just that this magnificent castle only has one bed. And every time, the male lead could only fall asleep sitting up. Therefore, Syphilia's suggestion. She wanted him to be able to lie down and rest properly. When the male lead heard this suggestion, his fantasies were instantly shattered. Although he was very grateful for Syphilia's kindness, the reality was that the room he was in was a key location for the castle's barrier. To ensure nothing goes wrong, he must stay in this room. Syphilia had this thought. Because the male lead, even knowing she possessed magic, never disliked her for it. Therefore, she wanted to repay him for his tolerance and understanding. Seeing this, he offered to teach her magic. After all, it seemed Syphilia still couldn't fully control her magic during the day. Even with the collar on and her magic was sealed, its power remains fearsomely strong. Although learning magic doesn't guarantee complete control over it, it will at least give her the power to protect herself. One day, she might even become a more powerful magician than him. To become the male lead's support, Syphilia is willing to learn magic for him. Although the male lead hoped she had chosen him of her own free will, regardless, Syphilia was now his top disciple. He found that he had changed a lot since living with Syphilia. He had never considered taking on a disciple before, much less imparting his knowledge and skills to others. Syphilia could sense that although the male lead pretended to be omnipotent on the surface, he was actually suffering inwardly. Therefore, she didn't think he was wrong. She would never forget his gentle treatment of her. The male lead was feeling quite good at the moment. He only hoped he could maintain this state. The next day, the male lead's best friend visited the castle. He had heard about the male lead being attacked by the paladin, so he came to check on him. To his surprise, the male lead appears unharmed. The purple-haired one is surprised by this, because the attacker was a paladin wielding the church's holy sword. Until Syphilia brought the tea, the purple-haired one stopped questioning him, but when the purple-haired one noticed Syphilia's presence, he became even more surprised. Isn't this the million gold coin slave elf from before? The purple-haired one originally thought the male lead bought her to be a sacrificial offering. He didn't expect her to still be alive. The male lead had to come up with an excuse. He claimed Syphilia was his disciple. The main purpose of Purple Hair's visit this time was to confirm something, whether the male lead intends to contend for the Demon King's throne. The male lead didn't deny it. Although for him, as long as he has Syphilia, it's enough. But if he could obtain the Demon King's position, then no one should be able to threaten Syphilia's safety anymore. But the male protagonist doesn't think he can become a Demon King. After all, he's only been a magician for 10 years. And for magicians who can live for thousands of years, centenarians are not uncommon. In terms of knowledge and experience, the male lead knew he had no chance of winning. At this time, the purple-haired man dropped his previous frivolous attitude, but he didn't say much about the Demon King. He only casually teased the male lead and Syphilia for a few sentences. Then he left. This left the male lead unsure of his true purpose, but he didn't think much of it. He took Syphilia with him to repair the barrier. He began to formally teach her magic. In the days that followed, Syphilia learned the fundamentals of magic arrays every day. At the same time, she didn't neglect her castle duties. Syphilia found her time with the male lead incredibly happy. Her facial expressions became much richer. Half a month later, Syphilia had mastered most of the basic magic. However, today, everything changed. A familiar sent by the 12 demon lords delivered an invitation to the male lead. The invitation stated that 12 demon lords required his presence. Following the instructions on the invitation, the male protagonist arrived at his destination. He found all 12 demon lords present. Just as he was pondering their reason for summoning him, a single sentence made him acutely aware of the vast chasm between them. With his current strength, he absolutely cannot fight it. At this time, the other party commented, he should have broken the record for the youngest candidate to become a demon lord. However, the male protagonist didn't think much of it, saying, if there's nothing else, he's about to go back. As expected, his reaction, however, piqued the Demon King's interest. So the Demon King bluntly proposed to make him the 13th Demon King. The male lead could feel the immense magical power contained within the crest. He finally understood. Becoming a demon lord isn't simply about gaining a title. It's this very point that leads to the vast difference in power between demon lords and ordinary magicians. The other party also knew among all the candidates, the male lead's power isn't the strongest, but he's definitely the most gifted. This is because when he was a child, he was taken by Andras. With just a glance, he copied and countered the opponent's magic. No one else possesses this ability. The key is that he's only a teenager now. Other magicians would need at least 100 years to achieve what he has. At least 100 years. Of course, becoming a demon king has its advantages and disadvantages. It does allow him to stand at the peak of magicians, but such a dazzling existence will attract the attention of more factions. At that time, the important people and things around him may be implicated. At this moment, he thought of Syphilia. He felt very conflicted. After a brief struggle, he finally chose to accept. But the condition was that the other party must agree to one of his conditions, and the other party immediately said that it was no problem. The male lead instantly returned to the castle. Syphilia saw him return and excitedly went to greet him. But when she saw the gloomy expression on his face, her mood involuntarily turned to worry. After a moment of contemplation, the male lead revealed to her the fact that he had become the demon lord, and that he inherited the legacy of the previous demon lord. Then, under Syphilia's gaze, he took out a key. He inserted it into the unique magic circle on the collar. As the key turned, Syphilia finally broke free from the collar. However, before Syphilia could ask why, the male lead told her that he had become the demon king. Therefore, he no longer needed her. For her safety, the male lead could only painfully abandon her. When Syphilia opened her eyes again, she found herself transported to a small town. She couldn't understand why the male lead had changed so drastically. He didn't even explain before driving her away. The male lead had clearly said before that he needed her. Now confirmed. The man never imagined that his worries about attracting numerous enemies as a demon lord might ultimately endanger his beloved Syphilia, so he cruelly drove her away from him. However, he never expected his best friend to suddenly reveal his true feelings. No longer hiding his true intentions, he directly abducted the lone Syphilia, intending to use her as a human sacrifice for a mysterious magic ritual, finally summoning a demon to kill the man and seize the demon king's throne. Just 2.5 minutes ago, Syphilia's eyes began to glaze over, abandoned by her master. As footsteps approached, she saw the church's red-haired paladin. Syphilia, a magician's servant, knew well what fate awaited her upon meeting a paladin, so she stood up and actively sought death. For her, without the male lead, life had lost its meaning. Now the redhead is a little hateful. She had once been saved by the male lead, standing on the same side as him. Therefore, she never had any intention of harming Syphilia. However, this unexpected conflict attracted the attention of the townspeople. They came to watch. When they discovered that Syphilia was the one being bullied, the residents were furious. Syphilia came to town to shop every day. Her gentleness and charm won everyone's affection. They considered her one of their own. The onlookers began to blame the redhead. At this moment, the clothing store owner suddenly appeared. She thought Redhead Girl was bullying the kind-hearted Syphilia, so she began to constantly reprimand Redhead Girl. Faced with everyone scolding, Redhead Girl felt like her heart was about to break. She clearly hadn't done anything, yet she seemed to have become the source of all evil. Luckily, Syphilia continuously explained to everyone, which cleared her name. Then, the Uyghur girl took them both to a restaurant for a meal. However, when she saw the mutton soup served, Syphilia recalled the scene of preparing dinner for the male lead earlier. She had a mental breakdown. She sobbed uncontrollably. She couldn't understand why the male lead abandoned her. Seeing this, the birdwing girl immediately gave her facial cleanser to comfort her. After a conversation, the two learned of Syphilia's ordeal. Syphilia then asked what kind of person the demon lord was. The bird girl explained that the demon lord was the most powerful being among magicians. This city was once ruled by the demon lord, Xiaz, but after his death, a series of kidnappings occurred. Redhead stated that, to the church, the demon king is an evil symbol that must be defeated. The church possesses 12 holy swords, but the demon lord has 13. Therefore, when a new demon lord appears, they will eliminate it as quickly as possible to prevent its growth. Furthermore, other magicians will also hunt down the demon lord's location, and fought for it. At this moment, Syphilia realized the male lead was in danger. To protect her from harm, the master made that decision. At this time, the red-haired person asked Syphilia whether she thought the male lead was a real kidnapper. Syphilia firmly answered, no. She knew deep down that the male lead wouldn't easily attack the weak. He had even driven away bandits who tried to rob him. Hearing this, the redhead breathed a sigh of relief. She knew the male lead wasn't a bad person. She recalled her last encounter with the male lead. She was constantly being pushed out to sea. Then she said, when they first met, she sensed that the male lead desperately needed help, but outwardly appeared indifferent, unwilling to admit it. Syphilia felt a resonance with these words. Developing a fondness for the redhead, she quickly decided to return to the male lead's side, because she understood that even if the male lead was incredibly powerful, this doesn't mean his heart is equally strong. Redhead also realized he shouldn't blindly follow anymore, so she decided to find the real culprit, to clear the male lead's name, as a return for saving his life. Later, unexpectedly, the three became good friends. However, this joy didn't last long. Redhair's subordinate suddenly appeared, interrupting this pleasant moment. Upon seeing Syphilia, who could use would release, the man who should have been dead was terrified out of his wits. Amidst the ensuing chaos, the killer silently attacked from behind. A mysterious black substance suddenly appeared. It enveloped and dragged away Redhead and Syphilia. At this time, the male protagonist, who had just driven Syphilia away, was feeling down. But he didn't expect that in the trap beside him. But suddenly, 3 unlucky fellows appeared. They were the 3 knights of the heavens who had attacked the protagonist before. They came to beg the protagonist to spare their holy knight prince. Hearing this, the protagonist was momentarily stunned. He hadn't had time to ask further. Another person has entered the castle. The male protagonist is confused. He wonders about their intentions, but what he hears next shocks him. Syphilia has been captured. The female paladin was also taken. This news put the male lead in a difficult position. The reason he sent Syphilia away was to distance himself from her. If he were to save her now, wouldn't he be announcing to everyone that Syphilia is his weakness? In that case, Syphilia will face countless threats. Seeing the male lead hesitate, the bird person girl immediately gave him a shot of encouragement, telling him that when Syphilia learned he was in danger, she immediately decided to return. And when the male lead learned Syphilia was in danger, he was still hesitating. These words brought the male lead to a sudden realization. He recalled the time he spent with Syphilia. He realized how obvious Syphilia's feelings were, but he had been ignoring them. Thinking about this, the male lead made up his mind. He would save Syphilia no matter what. Just as the Birdman girl said, magicians are all self-interested and heartless scum. So the male lead decided. He'd rather become a complete scoundrel than fail to rescue Syphilia. The bird girl, who just moments ago scorned the male lead, suddenly found him incredibly handsome. Seeing the male lead quickly set up a teleportation array, the bird girl felt confused. Could the male lead already know their whereabouts? Meanwhile, Syphilia and the redhead were imprisoned in an underground cave, and the person who kidnapped them was the male lead's best friend, the purple-haired one. It turned out that the magician defeated by the male lead years ago was the purple-haired one's master. Although the purple-haired one wouldn't seek revenge for his master, but he would never let the male lead off easily, because the castle, knowledge, and the funds used to buy Syphilia that the male lead possesses were originally supposed to be his master's inheritance. Now they've been seized by the male lead. How could he possibly give up? Therefore, all these years he has been secretly plotting, but each time ended in failure. That's right, last time, the people from the church invaded the male lead's castle. It was him secretly manipulating things. And this time, his target is not the male lead, but to hold an important ceremony, to prove his worthiness to be the next demon lord. He had been worrying about not finding a suitable sacrifice, but he never expected to capture Syphilia all alone. Her pure and potent magic will surely open that door. Syphilia saw the purple-haired man reveling in self-satisfaction. She immediately threw cold water on him, telling him he can never become the Demon King. Because the title of Demon King has already been inherited by the male lead, the purple-haired one collapses instantly after hearing this, but it also strengthens his resolve to perform the forbidden ritual. As long as he succeeds, even the Demon King will have to submit to him. After saying this, he drags Syphilia to a dark magic circle. Seeing this scene, Redhead panicked. She declared herself a paladin. If a human sacrifice were needed, it should start with her, but unexpectedly, Purple Hair wasn't interested in her, because the ritual requires high-quality props. Hearing the word props, Syphilia understood. Syphilia recalled her painful past. From childhood to adulthood, she had always been used as a tool, but the male lead had never treated her that way. She made up her mind. She absolutely couldn't let the male lead down. She had to survive. She had to return to his side. No matter how many times she was driven away, she would insist on staying in the castle. Thinking of this, Syphilia began to struggle desperately, but she was no match for the purple-haired. She was quickly pulled to the ground. However, for her now, this pain meant nothing. Hearing this, the purple-haired man scoffed. He was about to knock Syphilia unconscious. But unexpectedly, at that moment, the elf girl never expected. A man who couldn't even say he liked her would so domineeringly declare that she was his. Forever, a lifetime, even if I die, she's mine. Just now, his former best friend, Purple Hair, was about to sacrifice the female lead. When the male lead arrived just in time, he jokingly said he hadn't seen Purple Hair for a week. The purple-haired one also asked the male lead when he first noticed it. The male lead answered honestly. He had been suspicious of him from the very beginning, especially when the self-proclaimed face-peeling magician broke into his barrier. He didn't believe that someone who had only briefly clashed with him, only a magician who begs for mercy, can break through his barrier. Clearly, someone is manipulating things behind the scenes. Furthermore, Purple Hair's behavior after the Holy Knight attack looks like he's just checking the results. The male protagonist says, Purple Hair's behavior is suspicious, to say the least. However, what angered the male lead most was Purple Hair hurting Syphilia. In an instant, the male lead rushed to Purple Hair's side, and first crippled his hand. Then came his legs. In an instant, he killed the purple-haired man. Immediately after, the male lead quickly untied Syphilia's shackles. He gently asked her if she was in pain. While the male lead and Syphilia were showering each other with affection, Purple Hair suddenly cast a magic circle. Syphilia was startled by this sudden event, but the male lead calmly reassured her not to worry, because everything was under his control. Sure enough, Purple Hair's magic circle suddenly lost its effect. The magic failed to activate. The purple-haired man froze, bewildered. He then tried to activate a new magic array, but he met with the same fate. Syphilia was also curious about what was going on. The male protagonist explained to Syphilia, "Do you remember what he mentioned before? The theoretically strongest magician? Adding circuits to the magic circle to control the magic cast by the opponent? In fact, a similar secret technique exists that can achieve this effect. Just by constructing a magic circle identical to the opponent's, it can be superimposed, and the resulting resonance-like phenomenon will cause the magic to fail." The male protagonist first used this technique when he was 8 years old. He remembered the magician Andras. The magic circle used to capture him and he recreated the pattern on his hand using his own blood. It's just a childish trick. After all, even if you can mimic the shape of the magic circle, an amateur couldn't possibly cast magic like that. However, when the male protagonist faces the lightning magic that is about to take away his life, he actually succeeded in performing the same magic trick. His magic rebound on Andras. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but the male lead began to think how to elevate this reflexive skill to a higher level. With this in mind, he embarked on his research journey as a magician. Regarding the male lead's explanation, Purple Hair thinks this is impossible. He questions whether this is a legacy left by Andras. The male protagonist responds sarcastically, if Andras had mastered such a technique, he wouldn't have ended up being killed by his own creation. The male protagonist thinks it's magic resonance, just sees the opportunity. Even a magic novice can achieve it. But as someone who has deeply researched this technique, he pursues a higher standard and a more refined mastery. He not only absorbed the magic array Purple Hair just used, but also transformed it into magic for strengthening the body. It was like magic, swallowing up Purple Hair. Simultaneously, the male lead proudly told Purple Hair that he had also won a title, Magician Killer. Under the male lead's single strike, the purple-haired one was blasted 200 meters away. His defensive magic was completely absorbed by the male protagonist. Even with the use of body-enhancing magic, he couldn't defeat the male protagonist. This shows that as long as the male protagonist wants to, even a demon king couldn't stop his attack. Faced with this reality, Purple Hair immediately surrendered, promising to never appear before the male lead again and offering all his knowledge to the male lead. To beg for mercy, Purple Hair even mentioned that he and the male lead were once close friends. Purple Hair asks the male lead what this means. The male lead replies, even if he killed Purple Hair, it wouldn't matter. But if Purple Hair were to die, he would lose a good friend who provides him with fine wine. After all, his knowledge of wine isn't extensive. Purple Hair felt the male lead was humiliating him. But the male lead's response was unusually simple. This is the composure of a strong person. Purple Hair unwillingly declared, one day he would kill him, before he died of old age. He absolutely won't give up. The male lead didn't care at all. But he proposed a condition. Every time the purple-haired one loses, he has to offer fine wine. The purple-haired one thought the male lead was talking nonsense. What good would it do a magician to not eliminate his enemies? But the male lead thinks, now that he's become a demon king, isn't it ridiculous to cling to these old conventions? He will do whatever he wants in the future. From now on, he will do as he pleases. If he wants Syphilia, the one he loves, to live under the sun, then he only needs to bring all the sunlit lands under his rule. Therefore, for his former good friend, the purple-haired one, he naturally wouldn't kill him. But if the purple-haired one is unwilling to accept this, then show me the power that can make you submit. Hearing this, Purple Hair helplessly said the male lead was an arrogant fellow. The male lead retorted, how else can one become a demon king without being arrogant? Just as Syphilia and the others were watching this heartwarming scene, the magic circle Purple Hair prepared earlier to sacrifice Syphilia, suddenly activated. Seeing this, the male lead asked Purple Hair if he still wanted to continue fighting. Purple Hair hastily denied it, saying it wasn't him who activated it. Only then did the male lead realize that when he had punched the ground just now, he had unintentionally interfered with the magic array on the ground. Faced with this strange magic, the male lead questioned the purple-haired man about what he intended to do with the magic array. This time, the purple-haired man was honest. He openly stated his intention to summon a true demon using it. As the magic circle's light flickered, a gigantic shadow emerged from it. Demons are said to be a race that left this world in ancient times. The sigils used by modern magicians or the church. These are all writings left behind by gods or demons back then. And the male lead has now summoned a real demon. But because of the lack of a sacrifice, only a shadow has been summoned. Even so, the male lead realizes he can't easily resolve this situation. The male lead hadn't felt this much pressure even when facing the Demon King. This monster is beyond human capabilities. Just as the male lead thought he would die here, the monster knelt before him. He looked at the shadow monster kneeling before him. The male lead immediately understood. It obeys the Demon King's sigil. What have I inherited? The male lead, realizing this, immediately sent the shadow monster back to its own world. After the shadow monster left, the cave is about to collapse. The male lead immediately let everyone out. The knight saw that redhead had returned safely and couldn't help but weep with joy. The bird person girl also went to the male lead's side and reminded him that he needed to have a serious talk with Syphilia later. Then, the male lead turned to the purple-haired man. He asked if he still wanted to continue fighting. However, after witnessing the monster, the purple-haired man had completely given up on fighting. Purple Hair asked the male lead, confirmingly, whether it would suffice if he simply brought fine wine as an apology. The male lead expressed his great anticipation for Purple Hair to bring high-quality wine. Purple Hair wearily echoed him, saying he understood. Then he teleported away, leaving the male lead and Syphilia. When the male lead found it hard to speak, Syphilia said she wanted to stay by her master's side. Watching Syphilia grow stronger, the male lead also secretly made up his mind, because he had hurt Syphilia before, so she won't be alone anymore. I will protect her well. So Syphilia, don't call me master anymore. You are not a slave, a servant, or a disciple. I want to build a relationship with you on this basis, Syphilia. After they've confided in each other, Syphilia took out the slave collar again. She hoped the male lead would put it back on her. The male lead was about to refuse when Syphilia said she liked it, because it was a symbol between her and the male lead. The male lead never expected. Shortly after confessing his feelings to the elf girl, he unexpectedly gained a daughter. The male protagonist witnessed the demon's submission to the demon lord's emblem. He had been diligently investigating the secrets surrounding it, but to no avail. At this critical juncture, Syphilia silently came up behind him, wanting to surprise him. However, for the male lead, Syphilia's cute appearance was the biggest surprise, and the reason Syphilia came over was to call the male lead for lunch. Thanks to Syphilia's skillful hands, the male lead's diet improved from pig slop to increasingly rich fare. He also began to appreciate the pleasure of eating. Today, Syphilia even specially prepared pudding, a skill she learned from the bird girl. This left the male lead somewhat amused and bewildered. As expected, the bird girl made Syphilia put on some embarrassing clothes. But Syphilia didn't think it mattered. After all, she was only trying them on in her shop. Just as the male lead was lost in the sweetness of the pudding, he sensed another customer arriving. The visitor was a reptilian. It not only easily broke the protagonist's barrier, but also avoided all the traps. Finally appearing before the protagonist, the protagonist had some impression of this reptilian. It was also one of the candidates for the Demon King. Clearly, the lizard man's intention was to defeat the protagonist. He opened his mouth, preparing to attack. This finally enraged the protagonist. The lizard man was knocked away by the protagonist's punch. His head even rolled to the ground. Syphilia, standing nearby, immediately noticed something was amiss. She hurried over to check. She hadn't realized before, but she was shocked by what she saw. A little girl was actually hidden inside the lizardman's body. This startled the male protagonist. He was afraid he might accidentally hurt the little girl. Syphilia quickly comforted the male lead. She told him the little girl had only fainted. Then, while grumbling about this uninvited little green-haired girl, the male lead carried her to a room to rest. Syphilia watched him gently. I think the male lead is really gentle. After resting for a while, little green hair opened his eyes. Seeing the male lead, she threw a punch. The male lead easily caught the little girl's fist, and said in a teasing tone, "If Syphilia hadn't been there, this little green-haired brat would have had her neck twisted off long ago." However, in front of Syphilia, he couldn't possibly show his cruel side. The little green-haired brat attacked him because she yearned for the Demon King's power, make up for her own weakness. The male lead, as the newly promoted Demon King, is known as a magician killer. The little green-haired one thinks she might be able to rely on her own non-magical strength to defeat the male lead. The male lead also didn't expect that after the demons, he actually encountered a dragon, a fantasy creature. And dragons are beings that can live for thousands, even tens of thousands of years. He was confused, because he had no deep-seated hatred with the little green-haired one. Suddenly, the male lead had an epiphany. The little green-haired one's current predicament, just like when he was caught stealing food as a child. He found a seemingly easy target, only to be mercilessly beaten, almost to tears. Putting aside her identity as a magician and a dragon, little greenhair is just a child who made a mistake. And when it comes to dealing with a child who has made a mistake, the approach should be simple. The male lead directly punished little green-haired girl by making her help Syphilia with chores for the next week. He hoped that by involving green-haired girl in housework, he could teach her to distinguish right from wrong, teach her to follow the rules. However, after that, green-haired girl repeated her mistakes. The male lead will leave her alone. Green-haired girl suddenly asked the male lead if he wanted to eat her. This left the male lead speechless in surprise. So, dragon meat in this other world has a legend similar to Tang Sanzang's flesh. That's also why little green hair is hiding his identity. The male lead answers little green hair. Don't underestimate him. He could never do something like eat her childish cruelty. Little green hair started to cry softly. This bothered the male lead. He didn't know how to comfort her. Luckily, he recalled his own childhood. The older children would give him food to comfort him. So he asked Syphilia for the leftover soup from lunch, under the guise of the strong giving alms to the weak, and placed it in front of Little Greenhair. Little Greenhair was furious upon hearing this, almost overturning the table. But the male lead sternly stopped her. He hated people who wasted food the most, especially those who dared to waste Syphilia's carefully prepared dishes. Seeing the little green-haired one eating with relish, the male lead got up and prepared to return to his study. Before leaving, he once again urged the little green-haired one to listen to Syphilia. Green-haired girl stopped him. She asked if he was worried that she would attack Syphilia. The male protagonist answered that he wasn't worried, because Syphilia was much stronger than green-haired girl. Although he said so, he was still a little worried inside. So he secretly watched green-haired girl and Syphilia do housework together. Little green-haired girl was very well behaved in front of Syphilia. This is because she found Syphilia's soup very delicious. She also asked Syphilia to call her Far. Syphilia asked Far if she thought the male lead was scary. Far thought his appearance wasn't scary. On the contrary, according to the dragon race's aesthetics, she thought his mouth would look better if it were split a little wider. What's truly terrifying is the male lead's power. Syphilia reassured Far. The male lead wouldn't misuse his power. Syphilia also asked Far about the Empress's plans. Far herself doesn't know either, but she knows she needs strength. The male lead behind the tree is also curious about this. Far is curious why Syphilia follows the male lead. Syphilia explains that it's because the male lead bought her, but he never treated her as a slave. This became her home. However, when Syphilia asked about Far's home, Far said she had no home. In the following days, Far let down her guard and consistently helped Syphilia. Meanwhile, the male lead's investigation into the demons has yielded no results. So he decides to go to the former Demon King's castle. Just then, Far calls the male lead to the library for dinner. Far's words remind the male lead of his friend. He smiles and tells Far to challenge him anytime, but each time she failed, she would have to work an extra day of chores in the castle. At dinner, Far apologized for disturbing the male lead's meal earlier. After this incident, the male lead thought Far had learned her lesson. So he told Syphilia that next time he would take Far to the Demon King's castle to investigate. This made Far incredulous, because it was almost equivalent to imparting the former Demon King's knowledge to her, and he had also easily allowed her into his extremely important study. She questioned the male lead. "Didn't you ever think I would steal your knowledge?" The male lead didn't care. He believed that skills and knowledge are all learned by stealing. He himself did the same, but Far still couldn't understand this. The male lead thinks that no matter how many years Far has lived, no matter how excellent a magician she is, here, she's just a child. Children should behave like children. Being coquettish and willful is perfectly fine. They won't get angry with her for it. The male lead's words moved Far to tears. He quickly comforted her, telling her that she wouldn't cry anymore after eating the food Syphilia made. And that obeying him, the demon lord, wasn't a bad thing. At least this way, few people would dare to attack her. After dinner, Far, understanding the male lead's true feelings, fell asleep peacefully. Syphilia was also deeply moved, because she remembered how she felt when she first came to the male lead's side. This made the male lead a little shy, causing him to stumble over his words. "Because you are mine. Of course I cherish my own things." After shyness, the male lead noticed that Far was still holding a spoon. He carefully took it from her. Syphilia's words, whether intentional or unintentional, all of it deeply touched the male lead, the demon lord. Those words filled him with a longing for the ordinary happiness of having children and a family. "Look, this man is hanging out with his best friend again." His best friend was shocked to learn that the male lead is going to adopt a girl as his daughter. This is why he's doing this. It's because Far is obedient, well-behaved, and clingy. She even more wants to stay by the male lead and Syphilia's side. Her only flaw is that she's occasionally a third wheel. Far has been in the castle for 2.5 weeks. During this time, Far wrote many observation diaries about the male lead and Syphilia. She followed Syphilia, helping with chores such as cleaning the castle, doing laundry, and preparing meals. Although it's troublesome, she doesn't find it hard work, because she gets praised after working hard. On the other hand, the Demon King and Syphilia's relationship is hard to understand. Every morning, Syphilia goes to see the Demon King. She'll start work after admiring the Demon Lord's sleeping face. During that time, she'll admire it from various angles, and her pointy ears will wiggle slightly. Meanwhile, the Demon Lord spends his days in the library. He also personally explains magic to Syphilia. But I don't know why. The Demon Lord always makes Syphilia sit on his lap, and wants to touch Syphilia, but then retracts his hand. He keeps repeating this strange action. Syphilia seems a little hesitant, but she doesn't resist. The next day, after the bird girl meticulously dressed up Far, she found her very cute. She wondered if her fellow tribespeople watching are laughing. Seeing the bird girl so excited she wanted to take Far away, the male lead immediately stepped in to stop her. "How could I just give her to you?" After leaving the clothing store, the male lead complains that the bird girl is troublesome, but Syphilia thinks choosing her shop was the right decision. The male lead can only agree. After all, he can't let Far run around in armor, Having said that, Far took the male lead's and Sophilia's hands. This scene warmed the male lead's heart. It made him feel protective of Far. At this time, the red-haired girl, who had previously disobeyed orders and refused to attack the male lead, and was stripped of his holy sword and the title of Holy Knight, was also on the street. She was just imagining the male lead marrying Sophilia, having children, and living happily ever after. She couldn't help but think he'd be a father constantly worrying about his kids. Then she spotted the male lead and 2 others ahead, and she was even more surprised. Did the male lead and Sophilia already have a child? The male lead immediately stammered, telling the redhead not to talk nonsense. Sophilia and he haven't done anything yet. Far then asks the male lead who the redhead is. It turns out the male lead doesn't recognize her either. The redhead starts crying. She seems very wronged. Sophilia immediately steps in to remind the male lead. That's redhead girl. She's also Sophilia's friend. Right now, the 3 heavenly idiots are chasing after redhead girl, while the male lead and the 3 idiots are talking. Far prepares to attack the 3 idiots with a dark face, but the male lead immediately stops Far, because there are many friends of Sophilia in the town. Don't cause any deaths here. The 3 idiots, while shouting that it's dangerous for red hair to travel alone, escorted her back to the church. This made Sophilia a little worried about her, but the male lead thought red hair seemed trustworthy. It should be fine. Then he asked if Far had a grudge against them. But Far asked him back, what's so strange about magicians hating paladins? No, it's quite normal. But the male lead hopes this won't become a problem. 2.5 minutes later, the male lead brought Fa and the others to the Demon King's castle. The Demon King's castle gave Fa a nostalgic feeling. Perhaps dragons once lived there. Hearing this, the male lead told Far to report to him if he found anything related to dragons inside. He also said Far could bring back any book she liked. After entering the castle, Sophilia was scared and clutched the male lead's sleeve. Noticing this, the male lead gently took her hand. Far asked the male lead what that thing was up ahead. The male lead believes it's a chimera born through magic. And it's also the guardian here. But since the former Demon King is dead, it's currently non-functional. Just don't touch it unnecessarily, and you'll be fine. Let's move on. Far discovered a dragon magic circle on the ground. She immediately reported it to the male lead. The male lead patted Far's head in praise. The magic circle on the ground is a hidden door mechanism. Far can open it. They waited for Far to open the door. Sophilia secretly looked at the male lead. Seeing Sophilia's blushing face, the male lead understood that Sophilia also wanted the same thing as Far. After opening the door, the 3 of them went downstairs together. They arrived at the former Demon King's library. The male lead then asks everyone to collect all the books related to the demon race and the symbol of the Demon King. Far followed the male lead asking if he could read minds. How did he know Sophilia's thoughts just now? The male lead answered her that it was because he often observed Sophilia. Far is a little envious of this, but the male lead said to Far, demons can live for thousands of years. You have 1,000 years. I can sense your feelings. Far suddenly noticed something on the bookshelf beside him. A book titled 12 Holy Swords. The male lead saw it and immediately took it. He then discovered that the writing on the Holy Swords and the Demon King's sigil were from the same writing system. In other words, by investigating the Holy Swords, he could understand the Demon King's sigil. On the other hand, Redhead Girl and the others welcomed the Grand Knight. Redhead Girl thought the Grand Knight had come to kill her for her apostasy. Therefore, she was prepared to die. The 3 bumbling idiots of the Azure Heaven stood before Redhead Girl, urging her to flee. At this time, the bishop also stepped forward to stop the paladin captain. He emphasized that he had a duty to protect these paladins. Although the paladin captain wasn't interested in the bishop, he asked him where he'd put the redhead's holy sword, because the holy sword recognizes its owner, and its owner is still alive. Then this holy sword cannot be used by others. Therefore, the redhead must be eliminated. And how the holy sword's wielder will deal with the holy sword is not for the bishop to interfere with. The redhead refutes the Grand Knight. If, as you say, you wield your sword for personal desires, no different from thugs. The paladin captain, after hearing this, angrily pointed his sword at the redhead and asked the bishop, "The paladin you are supposed to protect is about to die at my hands, unarmed. Is this really alright?" Seeing this, the bishop had no choice but to return the holy sword to the redhead. He was still worried whether this would cause her to be killed by the captain commander of the Holy Knights. As a result, the redhead got the holy sword, but the captain commander of the Holy Knights left. In the tavern at night, the male lead's best friend is laughing at him again. He asks the male lead if he's really going to live with the little girl. The male lead is angry and helpless. He asks his best friend how he found out about this. His best friend tells him not to play dumb. The rumor that he tricked the little girl is all over the place now. After hearing the male lead's story, he was about to leave, but his best friend couldn't let him go so easily. So he pestered the male lead again, asking who the girl was. Upon learning that she was someone he knew, he was immediately surprised that the little girl was actually a magician. And the male lead also asked his best friend to solve the problem. He treated the little girl as his goddaughter. His best friend burst into laughter after hearing this. The male lead thought he was hopeless. But the next second, his best friend changed his attitude. He stopped joking. He came to see the male lead this time. It's because he learned that the church's Grand Knight is here. He has already killed 499 magicians. And the male protagonist is about to be chosen as the commemorative 500th. The male protagonist finds it strange. Even if the Grand Knight is the wielder of the Holy Sword, how could he have killed so many magicians? Regarding this, his good friend explained that he once killed and ate a dragon. And the reason why his good friend revealed this information to the protagonist was to apologize for past events. He also felt that being a good friend would bring more benefits. Just as the protagonist agreed to give his good friend some of the Demon King's legacy, the High Paladin entered the tavern. The man observed the elf girl closely, her face, her eyes, her ears, and her pleasant fragrance. But this beautiful atmosphere was interrupted by his best friend. She came over holding a red envelope. It was just now. My good friend was surprised to see the Grand Knight here. He immediately prepared to launch a magical attack, but the male lead stopped him. The male lead invited the Grand Knight to sit down. This made the Grand Knight remark that this new Demon King was quite composed. However, the male lead didn't want to chat with the Stone Knight captain. He wanted his best friend to save the situation. But he found him treating the female shop assistant who had just fainted from fright. The Knight captain heard that the male lead had taken care of their people. So he came to see what the male lead looked like. The male lead joked that his face was better looking than the Knight captain's. He looks quite ordinary. But the Knight commander says his face is as evil as the rumors say. The protagonist asks him, I hear your hobby is killing magicians. Aren't you going to make a move? There are 2 magicians here. Hearing this, his best friend, who had 1 foot out the door, reluctantly came back. The Knight commander found the question utterly boring. He was merely acting in self-defense. It was always the other party who struck first. This was different from what the male lead and his companions thought. The Knight commander asked if the redhead had already fought the male lead. Is she strong enough to stand against you? The male lead isn't sure, but it's certain that the redhead is the most troublesome one. That means the redhead does, indeed, pose a threat to the church. This left the male lead a little confused. The Knight commander explained that the redhead opposed the subjugation of the Demon King. This was a crime punishable by death from the church. The male lead was very surprised. It would have been fine if the redhead had just pretended to cooperate, although he had long suspected she wouldn't live long. But he didn't expect it to be like this. The Knight commander also agreed with the protagonist's opinion. Then he stood up and was about to leave. At this moment, the protagonist suddenly understood. The Knight commander came to him without killing intent. It turned out to be to confirm the relationship between the redhead and himself. It's hard to find a legitimate reason to kill red hair. The male lead stops the Knight commander. He tells him that red hair is quite popular in this town. Many people would be heartbroken if she died. Besides, this town is my territory. If you go too far, watch out, or I'll crush you. The Knight commander thought that didn't sound like something a demon lord would say, but the protagonist said that's exactly the kind of arrogant remark a demon lord would make. The Knight commander smiled, saying the protagonist was exactly as he expected. This is the evil the church is sworn to eradicate. This annoyed the protagonist. His best friend, the magician, already disliked the paladin. Otherwise, let's chase after him and kill the paladin captain now. The male protagonist agrees, and asks his best friend to carry out the plan. Aren't you sending me to my death? The male protagonist does hope his best friend dies, but this time, he just hopes his best friend can help confirm red hair's condition. His best friend is very good at misdirection magic. His best friend asked him if he really wanted to save red hair, but he said he'd give him more benefits. No more nonsense, hurry up. His good friend left with a parting shot, saying, you'll definitely regret this later, and then left. Late at night, Sophia was still awake, waiting for the male lead to come home. The reason for this was that Far insisted on waiting for the male lead to return. However, she couldn't help but fall asleep first. Sophia heard Far say that the male lead would accompany her for 1,000 years. This made Far very happy. As a long-lived dragon race, having someone to spend a long time with is very precious. So the hatred for her parents' murder is even heavier. We must eliminate him before the Knight commander meets Far. Sophia wishes she could accompany the male lead for 1,000 years. What are you saying? Sophia will accompany him for 1,000 years, of course. His best friend suddenly rushed over, yelling that something terrible had happened. But the male lead, whose shameful secret was almost discovered, was filled with rage, preparing to mince his best friend into meat paste. This left his best friend completely bewildered. Redhead girl is unconscious now. She must have been poisoned. The male lead immediately asks Sophia for help. She needs treatment now. Far wakes up because of the commotion. When she sees Redhead girl, the holder of the holy sword, she immediately launched an attack. The male protagonist stopped Far. Because his good friend and the redhead were his guests, she couldn't just kill them. He asked Far if she hated the Holy Knight. Far answered him, you should realize you became a magician for revenge. But the male lead says that wasn't the redhead's doing. Killing her won't alleviate the hatred. Instead, it will only create more enemies. This is a common mistake for revenge rookies. Far questions back, what do you know? The male lead thinks revenge requires exhausting all means to torment the other person, to make the other person fall into the abyss of despair and terror, then make them kneel and beg you to kill them. Only then is it right. Far and Syphilia were stunned. Far asked the male lead if he had taken revenge before. The male lead answered that he had. But he messed it up. He killed the other person instantly. It wasn't satisfying at all. So he's going to personally teach her the correct way to take revenge. And conveniently, the castle is full of torture devices. His best friend calls out the male lead. Is it really okay for you to teach your adopted daughter these things? Shortly after, the redhead regained consciousness. The male lead told her to remember to thank Syphilia. It was Syphilia who cured her poison. This reminded the redhead of being summoned out by a letter before. The masked person she met identified themselves as a member of the Symbiosis faction. They believed the church was an organization suppressing magicians. They shouldn't hunt magicians. He wants to invite Redhead Girl to join. Redhead Girl thought, he's actually here to help me now? Could it be that the bishop sent him? The masked man told Redhead Girl not to answer now, but time is running out. At the same time, in order to prove it, from now on, whenever Red Hair needs help, she only needs to say the name Europa, and he will protect her under any circumstances. On the way back, Red Hair hesitated whether to believe the masked man, but if she loses the church as her refuge, even if she is alive, she doesn't know what to do. Then the redhead drank the poison tea. Anyway, the redhead is Syphilia's friend. The male lead will still take care of her until she recovers. However, the redhead stopped the male lead who wanted to leave. She asked him to stay and keep her company for a while, but he thought it was better to leave it to Syphilia. That's what he said, but his body sat down anyway. It turned out Syphilia was already asleep. He couldn't bear to wake her. So he claimed he was just reading here. After the redhead apologized to the male lead, he wondered what he should do. Should he intervene between him and Syphilia? No. Regardless of whether it's him or Syphilia, she hoped they can be happy. But she also hoped to be somehow connected to their happiness. But what form would that connection take? Redhead Girl thinks it'll only be through swordsmanship. Why is she working as a maid now? Although the male lead let her rest, but he didn't intend to let her freeload. Red Hair understands this. It's just that he's still uneasy. After Red Hair found Far, she wanted to greet her, but Far called her tadpole head. Red Hair wondered what she did wrong. The male lead explained that Far's father seems to have been killed by a holy knight, though it's unrelated to the redhead. But the male lead also can't ask Far to sort this out. Hearing this, the redhead thinks it's best for her to leave. The male lead tells the redhead to just leave Far alone. She's a proud and haughty race. She'll play any silly tricks on Red Hair. The male lead complains, what's wrong this time? They see Far placing a frog on Red Hair's face. It's only been a week, and this is the third prank already. Red Hair thinks this isn't what was agreed upon. However, this is actually Far's compromise, the result of replacing force with pranks. Far, that child, vents her emotions this way. Redhead Girl noticed the male lead is quite indulgent towards Far. Unexpectedly, Redhead Girl is really useless outside of battle. But the male lead thinks Redhead Girl has at least perked up a little now. Redhead Girl wondered if the male lead was worried about her. After that, Far's pranks increased in frequency. She felt that Redhead Girl was clearly a paladin, but wouldn't dodge. She found Redhead Girl a little pathetic. Unknowingly, this has become part of the castle's daily routine. That night, Far dreamt that her father was murdered. After waking up, she came to the red-haired's room. Far never imagined that since arriving at the male lead's castle, she would feel so much warmth. She liked the male lead gently stroking her head. She liked even more burying her face in warm, wet chest of Syphilia. Although she learned a lot in the castle, but with the increase of happiness, she gradually forgot her original intention of revenge. To prevent her happiness from extinguishing, and fueled by her obsession with revenge, Far decides to leave the castle. Thus, the Demon King's observation diary ends here. Far arrives alone at the former Demon King's castle. She believes she can find the power to kill the holy sword wielder there. However, the moment she opened the door, a man's voice came from behind her. The familiar scent immediately identified him to Far. After seeing his face, Far's memories returned. The Knight Commander was the one who murdered her father. Anger clouded her judgment. Far knew he was outmatched, but still charged towards the opponent. Luckily, at the critical moment, the male lead appeared in time and blocked in front of her. She didn't expect the male lead to show up, and the male lead said, the moment Far disappeared, he guessed where she would go. So he had his best friend teleport him here. Far felt she had betrayed the male lead. Not only did she run away from home, but she also attempted to steal the Demon King's inheritance. Therefore, she didn't deserve to be saved by him. But the male lead didn't mind these things. He believed that anyone who bullied his precious daughter must pay the price. The Knight Commander is no pushover. His powerful aura even shocked his best friend nearby. Far also doesn't understand why the male lead wants to force out the Knight Commander's strongest side. The male lead explains that he promised Far before the most beautiful way of revenge. The goal is to let the opponent use their full power, then completely defeat them, to make them feel despair. Just then, the Knight Commander charged at the male protagonist with his sword. The male protagonist used a magic circle to defend. Two powerful forces collided instantly. To the Knight Commander's surprise, the protagonist's magic circle wasn't destroyed even by his strongest attack. The protagonist explained, "This is a new magic I developed, combining the legacy of the former Demon King, called Celestial Scales. It can absorb surrounding magical power indefinitely, thus constantly increasing its hardness." The Knight Commander continued to wield the holy sword. The male protagonist successfully blocked his 3 attacks. When the shield shattered, the Knight Commander was shocked. The male protagonist had already anticipated this, because this shield isn't a perfect creation yet. He's been using the Knight Commander for experiments. The experiment is over now. The protagonist landed a strengthened normal attack on the Knight Commander. The protagonist felt the Knight Commander was rather weak. After all, he had once defeated nearly 500 mages. He shouldn't be unable to withstand even a single blow. As expected, the Knight Commander quickly got back up. Meanwhile, the redhead wanted to support the male lead, but she also worried that she would be misunderstood as a fence-sitter. She's confused inside. She doesn't know what she's fighting for. Redhead girl says she envies the relationship between Syphilia and the male lead. They understand and care for each other. Syphilia says she envies redhead girl more, because Syphilia had to obey the male lead's orders and stay in the castle, while the redhead could go to the male lead's side to help him. These words reminded the redhead of her original intention. She decided to fight for the justice she believed in, regardless of any power. The scene shifts to the Knight Commander. He relied on his powerful regenerative ability. His wounds were healing rapidly. This caused Far to stare at him intently. The Knight Commander didn't understand why Far harbored such deep hatred towards him. Far spoke his father's name, Orobas. Only then did the Knight Commander realize that Far was the child of the wise dragon. This discovery seems to have driven the Knight Commander even madder. He seems determined to kill Far. The male lead senses something is wrong. He quickly tries to stop Far, who's still casting magic, but Far is blinded by rage. She can't hear anything. His good friend forgot to close the portal. The redhead rushed over because of this. She tried to get both sides to stop and talk. The male lead also agreed, because he noticed that the Knight Commander's killing intent suddenly vanished after hearing the name Orobas. He seemed to simply wish for death. The male lead's words shocked everyone present. They completely didn't understand what the Knight Commander wanted to do. The redhead also realized that the person who wrote to her was the Knight Commander. Just then, an astonishing demonic aura emanates from the castle. This is a guard of the Demon King's castle. His seal was broken by the aftereffects of the battle just now. The guard is greedily absorbing anything that can be converted into magical power, including humans. The male protagonist attempts to control the guard using the Demon King's mark, but it didn't succeed. Instead, the guard's heavy cannon fire headed straight for Far. At the critical moment, the Knight Commander stepped forward, using his own body to shield Far from the attack. This angered the male lead. He punched the statue to pieces with all his might. But the Captain Knight's injuries were too severe. The wound was too close to his heart. Even with the power of the dragon, it was difficult to heal. The male lead was very puzzled as to why the Captain Knight had sacrificed himself in such a way. He hoped the Knight Commander would explain to everyone what happened back then. The Knight Commander covered Far's eyes. Because the male lead and Syphilia were in such a state now, it was truly more than she could bear. Just 2.5 days ago, the Knight Captain told Far to kill him to avenge your father. That's completely wrong. That great dragon would absolutely never be killed by someone like me. Far thought he was lying. She had seen with her own eyes the Knight Captain devouring her father's flesh. It must be you who plotted against him. The Knight Commander retorted. Do you think the wise dragon you know would be defeated by the betrayal of mere humans? That day, we sought the wise dragon's help to eliminate the demons. She'd tell him to stop talking nonsense. She'd never heard of any demons surviving to this day. The Knight Commander understands Far's doubts. After all, he thought the same way initially. But that day, demons truly appeared in the world. Therefore, numerous holy knights and wise dragons sacrificed themselves. And in the near future, the demons will return. The male lead affirmed the Knight Commander's statement. He was searching for a way to kill the demons, which is why he was investigating the Demon King's emblem and the Holy Sword. Far asked if his father was defeated by demons. The Knight Commander told her that the wise dragon sacrificed himself to successfully annihilate the demons. The Knight Commander thought that if Farl killed him, and it would make her proud of the wise dragon, he wouldn't mind giving his life to Farl. But the demons were very powerful. Now the church and the magicians are enemies. Once the demons return, there will be no chance of victory. So the wise dragon had him drink his own blood to barely survive that desperate situation. But now he has completed his mission. The seeds of symbiosis have begun to sprout. The male lead asks the Knight Commander, so you're the envoy of the symbiosis faction that Red Hair mentioned? At that moment, his best friend reminds the male lead, can the Knight Commander's words really be trusted? How many magicians have you killed so far? Now you preach peace? Who would believe your lies? The Grandmaster knows the truth. That's why he protects the redhead. She's the wielder of the holy sword, yet she's connected to the Demon King. He wants Red Hair to raise the banner of symbiosis. But Red Hair hasn't accepted it yet. Just then, the stone golem regenerates. The main character complains there are too many immortal beings. Red Hair asks if she can kill them permanently. The male lead thinks this artificial lifeform is something created by magic. It should be possible. But the Knight Commander cautions the male lead, that's not an artificial lifeform. It's a composite created by the Demon King Magasha using the remains of demons he and the Wise Dragon defeated together. Although its power isn't what it once was, it is still a demon. This piqued the male lead's interest. It's a perfect opportunity to experiment with some things. The redhead stepped forward then. She didn't expect the male lead to believe the paladin, but she hoped to fight alongside him. The male lead doesn't think the red-haired one is clever enough to be faking it. The red-haired one suddenly charged forward. Using the holy sword, she split the laser from the stone golem guard. Taking this opportunity, the male lead also rushed forward. He met the stone golem's fist head-on. He smashed it with a direct blow. Although the stone statue shattered and dissipated, the fragments were manipulated by the black mist and stabbed towards the protagonist. Then the protagonist realized that this thing, the black mist lurking within, was the true form. No wonder the shattered rocks can be restored. Red Hair arrived just in time to support, slashing out countless sword lights. Watching Red Hair's sword saint-like performance, the male protagonist was surprised. If she had this strength back then, he would have died long ago, but now, he can endlessly absorb the surrounding magic and burn it away. These two magic spells, one inside the other, are what the male lead created to fight the holy sword and the demons. But right now, the completion rate isn't high enough. If we don't further improve our efficiency, we won't be able to deal with the demons. Redhead Girl thought the male lead was a truly terrifying magician. The male lead replied to Redhead Girl, "Your skills aren't bad either, Cece." This left Cece stunned, because this was the first time the male lead had called her by her name. The male lead, reminded by her, realized his mistake. He apologized to Cece. He considered Cece to be Sophilia's friend after all. She should be given respect. However, Cece stated that she didn't come just for Sophilia. She also wanted to prove she could fight alongside the male lead. Far urged the male lead to come quickly and treat the Knight Commander's wounds. At this time, the Knight Commander told Cece, regardless of her thoughts now, her actions have already become a benchmark for their symbiosis faction. The compatriots who share the same ideals as the Knight Commander will become Shesity's fighting force in the future. Cece asks the Knight Commander, "Did you borrow the Wise Dragon's name before because you couldn't convince people yourself?" The Knight Commander doesn't deny this. But the establishment of the symbiosis faction is the late dragon's will, so only his title is worthy. The male protagonist is confused. The Knight Commander holds such ideals, yet why did he kill so many magicians? Actually, the Knight Commander didn't want to kill them either. But the magician always attacked him. This left everyone astonished. He kept trying to politely talk to the magician. Even using a smile to show he had no hostility, he was still attacked. That's why the Knight Commander had no choice but to fight back and kill them. The male lead complains about his earlier behavior at the tavern. "Your attitude was incredibly arrogant and aggressive." The Knight Commander says he approached the situation with sincerity. He was expressing concern about the crisis for Cece. Cece complains about being asked how many magicians he'd killed upon their first meeting. The Knight Commander thinks Cece would have done the same. Then how can you set an example? And at that time, you also answered that it wasn't worth showing off. That's why I think you're the best candidate. The male lead told the Knight Commander to look in the mirror, to see his own ferocious appearance. That face, coupled with his misleading words and actions, everyone will treat you as an enemy. His good friend is criticizing the male lead, and he still dares to say others. The Knight Commander asks Cece to return to the church. "I will deal with those who want to harm you." Cece asks if he knows the culprit who poisoned her. The Knight Commander is surprised that Cece hasn't noticed yet. After saying these things, the Knight Commander told Far to wait a little longer. He couldn't give her life back just yet, but Far made him answer a question. To him, what kind of dragon was the Wise Dragon Ouroboros? The Great Dragon. The Knight Commander is proud to fight alongside the Wise Dragon. This is the most glorious moment of his life. Watching the Knight Commanders departing back, the male protagonist asks Far, "Is that enough?" Far doesn't know either. Is killing the Knight Commander right or wrong? The male lead tells Far that there's nothing wrong with it. It's time to go home. Sophilia is waiting for us, father and daughter. In the church, the bishop, in his sickness, believes that Cece should die for him. She shouldn't have sided with the magician. The holy sword should have been passed to the next wielder. If not for the interference, she would have been executed long ago. At this time, the Knight Commander arrived at the church. Seeing the heavily wounded Knight Commander, the bishop wanted to take the opportunity to eliminate him, someone who sought to establish his own power within the church. But the Knight Commander severed the bishop's hand, which was smeared with poison, and allowed this bishop, who obstructed the development of the symbiotic sprout, to die beneath his favorite holy sword. The next day, Cece received the news. She sighed, realizing the prisoner was indeed the bishop. She had vaguely sensed it before. The male lead thought that those who brandished the banner of justice were never any good. She felt the church's current ideology was problematic, but she wanted to change the church gradually, so she's going back to the church. Listen to this. The male lead scared Cece by saying her tea was poisoned. This gave her a huge fright. Of course, it was a joke. He hoped this would make Cece more cautious, so she won't make the same mistake again. Cece complained that the male lead was too much. He almost made her spill the tea Ophelia had brewed, but that tea was actually brewed by someone else. Cece came before Far. She sighed that she never got to have a proper conversation with Far in the end. She tried to touch Far's head, but she dodged her. Sure enough, only the male lead and Ophelia can do that. Just as Cece was about to leave, Far said she hoped Cece would come again. Cece was deeply moved that Far finally called her by her name. Far complained, "In the end, you're still crying." Finally, Cece thanked the male lead and his companions for their care. "Although I don't know if I can live up to the standard of a role model for the Symbiosis faction, I will do my best." It turns out Raphael was recovering at the male lead's home, and the tea just now was brewed by him. Cece originally thought he was already dead. Now you can rest assured. Raphael, however, warned Sai not to be too naive. If you're ambushed again, you can't blame anyone else. Then Raphael mentioned that he has now been hired by the male lead as a butler. Therefore, he has resigned from his position as the captain of the Holy Knights. It turns out the male lead sensed Raphael through the barrier earlier. He arrived at the castle gate, exhausted. He intended to offer his life as promised. He let Far decide. Far had given up revenge. She made Raphael serve the male lead and Raphael. This is also for her own good. Now, with Raphael's help, the male lead's research progress on the Demon King sigil will also increase significantly. He just feels that Raphael is somewhat similar to himself. Far noticed that Raphael is missing a hand. She used his own old armor to make him a new hand. This deeply moved Raphael. He wanted to dedicate his life to Far. Left aside, Zyso asked, "Is this the only ending, where only I leave?" Looking at the weeping Cece, the male lead told her she could come and go as she pleased. Ophelia and Far will be very happy too. After seeing Cece off, his good friend also came out to show his presence. He arrived just in time. The male lead asked his good friend to follow Cece and protect her well. He'll pay his best friend to do that. Seeing this, his best friend immediately hid in Cece's shadow. After sending them away, Ophelia was a little sulky. The man and the elven slave were mutually infatuated, but they had never gone any further. Today, the male lead brought a gramophone. He heard Ophelia's moving singing voice. The male lead invited Ophelia to dance. Just 2.5 days ago, Far, back in the castle, started writing in his diary again. New resident Raphael has excellent culinary skills. His cooking is comparable to Chef Ophelia's. He often makes desserts for Far. But when Fa tries to observe the intimate moments between the male lead and Ophelia, Raphael always ends up covering her eyes. For example, when Ophelia previously fed the male lead macarons, Far was preparing to carefully observe. Raphael, however, concealed his presence to stop Far. Raphael thought it was too soon for Far, but Far sensed something was wrong. The male lead and Ophelia haven't even held hands yet. If they're going to kiss, it'll probably take another few decades, but Far wants to win this battle completely. Afterwards, Ophelia called Far to go out together because Cece was coming over for the night. Ophelia prepared a meal to entertain her, so they're getting ready to go shopping in town now. In the streets, the male lead watches Ophelia. He feels she's becoming more and more integrated into town life. After buying groceries, Ophelia still wants to go to the bird girl's shop, but the male lead isn't too happy about it, because nothing good ever happens when he goes there. It turns out Ophelia was sharing macarons with the bird girl, as a thank you for her often teaching him how to cook. But the bird girl still wants Ophelia to try on clothes, of course. There's a way to do it, naturally. The situation unfolded exactly as he'd expected, but then he noticed the gramophone in the shop. He introduced the gramophone to Far. This can be used to listen to music. Unfortunately, the gramophone is broken. However, the male protagonist still decided to buy the gramophone at a high price. It was because the children from the alleyway were selling things there. He wanted to use this opportunity to have the bird girl take care of them, to give them some clothes. Afterwards, the male protagonist and his companions returned to the castle. They found that Cece was already visiting. Of course, that includes the male lead's best friend. He's just here to mooch a meal. Seeing this, Ophelia goes to prepare the meal. Cece says she wants to help too. The three of them immediately went to the kitchen. Far questions whether Cece can cook. Cece answered, "Almost everyone can cook," but the next second, she knocked the basket flying. Meanwhile, in the study, the male lead was figuring out how to repair the gramophone. His best friend came looking for him then, asking the male lead to find a way to deal with this clueless Cece. Ignoring her won't work. She'll really die. She's clumsy every night. She trips over herself in the middle of the night. She knocks over stacks of neatly organized files. His best friend couldn't stand it anymore. He is secretly helping. But she bumped into a cabinet again. His best friend was so scared, he immediately helped her up. This prevented him from sleeping properly. He's almost exhausted. Seeing this, the male lead comforted his best friend. He would let him drink freely. In the kitchen, Sophilia tried the soup Cece cooked. Instantly, Sophilia's expression became a meme. This is even more terrifying than the muddy water she drank as a child. She felt this would become a crisis at their dinner table. To protect the male lead and the others, Sophilia told Cece not to cook the soup anymore. Hurry back to your room and rest. Tonight, the male lead repaired the gramophone. Far listened to the music. She thought the atmosphere was really nice. Raphael also mentioned having seen a gramophone in a dance hall before. They used a gramophone to play music there. Gentlemen and ladies danced hand in hand to the music. It's just that he was attacked by a magician there. He was banned from entering after only one visit. Then everyone started to enjoy dinner. Cece praised Sophilia's cooking skills. One could taste different levels of flavor. But the drunk purple hair thought Cece was too obtuse. How could she possibly taste it? Hearing this, Cece retorted that he had no right to say that. Purple hair replied, if you're not reconciled, then don't sleep with your doll. Cece was stunned. How did he know about that? Were you using shadows to spy on me? In this situation, how could the male lead possibly say he did that to protect her? Then Sophilia came to smooth things over. Speaking of when Cece was poisoned, it was the purple-haired one who saved her. Hearing this, Cece relaxed. She immediately thanked the purple-haired man. The drunk purple-haired man, however, told Cece to thank him only after she becomes a better woman. Amidst the crowd's commotion, the gramophone broke down again. After the commotion, Purple Hair picked up the soup and drank it down. This was something far specially made for him. However, Purple Hair found the taste quite special. It was bitter, but invigorating. The more he drank, the more addicted he became. Sophilia was worried after discovering Purple Hair. Late night, Cece and Purple Hair were already asleep, but the male lead was still repairing the gramophone. Sophilia came to keep the male lead company, although it was a tiring day. But she's happy. Everyone is very satisfied with their meal. This is also the power of delicious food. Sophilia asks the male lead why he wants this gramophone. The male lead just wants to kill time. He also wants Sophilia to listen to some music. Then the hero repaired the phonograph again.